You could argue that 1998's Thief was mechanically incompatible with the design principles of AAA games nowadays. Although imperfect and improved upon with the second installment, it was an often frustratingly cryptic but deeply atmospheric Victorian medieval mix of crime, intrigue, and a dash of the supernatural. Any given objectives were written down and there was no indication of how to achieve them other than the ultimate goal and a few notes here and there. Finding out which way to go and how to go about it was entirely left to the discretion of the player. This was a time where paperback guides and walkthroughs in printed magazines were enjoyed rather than looked at as a burden. The question then is, what kind of player are you? When shooting for the highest sales, you're going to get a mix of responses. Some don't want any compromise, but ultimately a reboot is always going to mix things up. The balance is precariously placed upon the requirement to modernise, but how much is too much, and what's not enough? That is never easy. 2014's Thief attempts to recapture the atmosphere, theme and tone of the original games on paper, but in practice it fumbles where both Tomb Raider and Hitman Absolution fumbled also. It casualises all the wrong things, the things that made the original so good. And whilst things like smoother combat and slightly faster movement are appreciated, the level design completely changes the game for the worse, and painfully slow QTE for movement that could just be as easy as pressing a button are hallmarks of bad game design choices. I would go so far as to admit that 2014's Thief had all the necessary elements on paper for a brilliant Thief reboot, but everything was implemented for a demographic who is used to Dishonored rather than Thief, and it sort of forces you to ask the question, well, isn't there something inherently problematic when rebooting a title whose mechanics integral to the enjoyment of that title necessarily have to be removed or altered? How do you do it right? The answer, unfortunately, is compromise. Ken Levine ostensibly has figured out it's better to hit a passionate target with lower financial overheads than it is to try and please everyone, but unfortunately not everyone shares that same philosophy. Thief does, however, have redeeming factors though, so let's take a closer look. I want to start with a story but wanted to avoid beginning with a negative, but once again I find myself in a situation where I'm sure the story and characters make sense on paper at a table surrounded by brainstorming key phrases and concept art, but in practice what I'm certain is not too complex to understand is actually water thin and told pretty poorly. You are, of course, Garrett, a man who enjoys twatting people around the head, tossing their wallets into a chest and relaxing with some keyhole pornography before biblical flashbacks attune his sense of morality. I'm kidding, of course, because in reality you're still an odd-job thief chasing the ultimate objective, stealing everything you want along the way. At least that's how it is at first, and like most other reboots, these are the establishing shots, the scenes that make you go, yeah, okay, this is a real Thief, Tomb Raider, Hitman Absolution game. Quickly, however, you realise that being a thief has been diluted to looting, in the ARPG sense, and that the actual meat of the gameplay is darting around incredibly tiny, very linear maps, levels in fact, as you're handheld through a story.
The General wanted that ring already. What was that about?
I'm not even going to guess.
So let's take a look at the difficulty settings, these famed IDOS dynamic settings that let players of the originals dabble with different settings to make it feel like an original game. I liked Thief very much, so I chose a set of custom settings that disallowed weapons designed for killing, since this is a stealth game and Thief has never really been about stabby. If you want that sort of thing, you might as well go for Dishonored. I'm not really prepared to go back and restart the campaign for a second time with all the weapons enabled, so this review has been written with an emphasis on stealth. This is a stealth game after all. Despite my want for an original Thief dynamic, I was kind of upset to see that there's an indicator for where you have to go for every little thing in the game, aside for around 2 little puzzles easily solvable by looking around your immediate area. Even if your character is reading a clue for where to go next, you won't get that text or that hint. Instead you'll be told where to go, and you simply have to follow the white indicator. This is a massive departure from the original game, and even on the toughest difficulty it remains. This dumbfounded me and it completely took away from the immersion, as did the horrendously overpowering bassy music that came up every time I had to have my wits about me.
Bastard isn't here.
Nobody's here.
We should keep our wits about us. Does it feel what?
Music was a large part of the original Thief game because a lot of the game's success can be attributed to atmosphere, and the music was a large part of that. This time, however, as nice as the score might be outside of the game, it's just distracting and harsh. The meat of the gameplay is spent exploring the map on your way to the next objective, and I use exploring in inverted commas because this isn't an open world, and in actual fact the levels are more linear with perhaps a few rooftops and alleys as alternative routes. They're also really, really small. You can walk around 5 minutes before hitting a loading screen symbolised by a glowing orb. They said this wasn't a PC port, and sure, whilst it's graphically very pretty, the tiny levels are clearly a relic of the previous generations of consoles. Everything feels very tunnelled in, so it's not as though I felt very compelled to explore, and this has unfortunately affected the weapon requirements horrendously. The entire game is painfully easy, even on the highest difficulty settings, thanks in part to an oblivious AI who may as well be wearing the eye coverings of a shire horse, and I'm sure there's a name for that. Darting behind boxes and sticking to the shadows makes you impossibly invisible at all times, and aside from some water or glass bottles on the floor, I barely ever get spotted. In fact, the only times I got spotted was when I decided to run from one side of the little map to the other because it's quicker than being stealthy. Once through the loading screen, everything resets and you are absolutely fine. Because the levels are so linear, I didn't find one single use for the rope arrow, and when I tried to use it, it wouldn't let me, because to access that area of the map I had to use a lever. The game made that decision for me. Water arrows, too, aren't largely useful. There are only a few times where you'd have to douse a flame in order to get by, and most of the time you can simply wait for predictably scripted AI to shuffle along. But we've played Hitman, Splinter Cell, and even Tenchu for Christ's sakes. Players can predict enemy movement intuitively now, and the wide open spaces make it so incredibly simple to circumvent them. After around 2 hours of gameplay, they won't even seem like AI anymore, just another object to avoid. It's like avoiding one side of a cube. They're not threatening. This really is the biggest issue with Thief. By focusing on beauty and the fullness of the map and chasing larger numbers, they've forgotten what made the original game so great. Dishonored had more Thief-like environments with multiple points of entry. In 2014's Thief, your options are usually a parkour pathway highlighted with a bright blue climbable grate, or a ladder, or the front door. Everything is so incredibly superficial. Whilst you have to applaud the fullness and beauty of the levels themselves, that effort is completely undone by the size, scale and design, and holy crap, that's such a shame. Other weapons such as smoke bombs, noise arrows and other distraction techniques do exist, but I found it is always better to sneak by totally unnoticed than to draw attention. Alternatively, you can walk up behind them and hold Q to knock them out, instead of for some reason hitting them yourself with your baton. And this has problems in and of itself, because holding Q causes a delay in an all-important split-second moment. All for the sake of, are you sure you wanted to do that? Are you sure you didn't hit Q by accident? Yes, thank you, I'm not a complete idiot.
Now there's a job I would.
Thief does have some redeeming factors. Buying new tools to collect more items is pretty cool, such as the ability to carve paintings out of their frames and yank placards off the side of surfaces. But this really adds to the ARPG looting sense in Thief. Is it really all that fun to trudge along a map and pick every little freaking thing that's shiny up? Is it really that fun? Is looting what's important in a Thief game? I know it's called Thief, but surely the gameplay itself is more important than quirky unlockable looting animations. If you do feel like exploring, there are some side missions you can accept along the way to steal specific items and things like that, but for some reason I just felt that the tiny level areas really disrupted my sense of freedom to explore. It's nice that they're there though.
Or was it smoke so thick day became night?
Well, I read that before the Baron was born, the city was at war.
Read it, did you? Oh, naughty friggin' dog. Nothing like being...
Towards the end of a game, in a bizarre turn of events, Thief starts to resemble a Penumbra or Amnesia game as you traverse an abandoned haunted mental asylum. And seriously, this resembles Outlast a whole lot. Looking around the dark, dank and relatively modern environment, I really question if I was playing a Thief game at all. and as the supernatural elements ramped up, there was a sense that I was playing a legit horror game. Thankfully, after these sequences, you're back to the mansions and streets we all know and love, but I do miss the castles and scale of the original game's maps. I would take getting lost and frustrated over hand-holding and linear maps any day. So whilst Thief shows some semblance to the Thief games of yonderyear, several perhaps console-oriented new demographic design decisions completely obliterated any enjoyment I could soak up from the game. We don't need another Dishonored, and there will be some people rolling their eyes claiming that modernising is fine and that just because I don't like it I'm wrong. But you know what? There are a lot of games around, and if you don't like one, you can play something else. Is anyone else just a little tired of publishers creating games for people who don't like an IP, rather than for people who do?
Careful, she's off to fetch the piss pot.
Thief won't please anyone but the most insistent fans of the new stealth genre. It's not terrible, but it's deeply flawed, and because of that I just did not have a great time with it.